Oh, I've got it. Okay, make sure I'm on the wrong one. Yeah, wrong one. Okay, so you can see my screen, yeah? Everybody can see that, yeah?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think, thank you, Laura.
Okay, great. Okay, so my name is Laura Lundy. I'm a professor of children's rights at Queen's University Belfast and a professor of law at University College Cork. My background is in law and human rights, particularly the rights of children. And what I'm going to do for 15 minutes is I'm going to give you my take on the child's right to be heard for practice. And I'm going to do a specific focus on early childhood, where I know that most of you work. So I think many of you, particularly in Scotland, because it's such an exciting time to be Scottish if you're into children's rights with your plans to incorporate the convention. And this provision we know was actually very important in the bill, and also will be very important in practice in Scotland for making children's rights real. And that is Article 12 of the convention. I'm sure you know of it, but if you don't, you can have a little quick read. It's possible to do it quickly of the text of Article 12. It is quite a long provision, and it is slightly convoluted. And actually, whenever you see something a little bit complex like this in a human rights treaty, it means that it was contested. That means that the states who agreed it weren't too sure about it, and there was a little bit of discussion and negotiation, and it ended up looking like this. 2 parts. Children who are capable of forming a view are entitled to express it. And then when a child has expresses their view, that there's an obligation to give that child's views due weight with age and maturity. Okay, so that's the provision, Article 12. Actually, Article 12.1. Wanted to say that's here now is that who does it apply to? It's a right of individuals and it's a right of groups of children. What does that mean? That means whenever you're out in practice working with an individual child, so say if you're in an early learning centre, that individual child has a right to have their views taken seriously in the context of the decisions that perhaps only affect them. That might be what they play with or what they eat or what they're wearing, but it's also a right of groups of children. What does that mean? That means that children are entitled to be consulted as a group on the things that affect them more generally. So again, if you work in a particular context, like, a sports center or a school or an early childhood setting, or you're in an NGO that works with children, that means that children are entitled to be consulted on things that affect them generally, like the policies. That could be the child protection policy or the discipline policy or any other things that are decisions that are made more generally. Could be about resources. We can talk about that. So it's a right of individual children and a right of groups of children. And which decisions does it apply to? I think this is, there's what the text of the law says is that it applies to all matters affecting them, all matters affecting them. That is big and that is broad, and it actually doesn't limit it to their rights, which is what interests us. But I love this statement from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and they say we should, carefully listen to children where their perspective can enhance the quality of solutions. Now, some people could come at that in a very authoritarian way and kick children out thinking, well, how could they help? But I think, I kind of encourage you to think that children can generally enhance the quality of solutions when something's about them. And it behoves us to try to find out what they think and see what we can do to enhance the quality of solutions for children. My journey on this starts back a way long time ago, about 17 years in a study here for our Children's Commissioner in Northern Ireland. And we did a study of children's perspectives on their rights, where they felt they were ignored or underplayed. And what happened for me is I mentioned my background is in law, and I knew what the legal text, that was the first slide, I knew what Article 12 said from a legal point of view. I was talking to adults who worked with children all across Northern Ireland in every sector. And when I mentioned Article 12 to them, they didn't know what it was. They hadn't heard of the number, might have heard of the convention. But when I said, well, it's the requirement to seek children's views and take them seriously. And they would all say, oh, yeah, we do that. Yeah, of course we know that. That's part of our professional practice, as part of our competences. We do the voice of the child. That was often what the response was. In the middle, we talked to lots and lots of children, and what they said to us was, just didn't sit. What they said was, our views are not sought. And then if our views are sought, we're not taken seriously. Or if our views are not sought and we offer our views, we tell adults, in any context, We did family, school, community, policing, justice. They said, we're dismissed. And actually sometimes what happens is adults think we're being cheeky and we're challenging their authority. So it didn't add up. There was this disconnect between legal requirement, what children were experiencing, and what adults understood was the obligation. And that took me to this. It took me to really thinking about this notion of the voice of the child. And I just knew this concept wasn't working. It wasn't working, along with other summaries, the right to be heard and the right to have a say. Not that you can't use them. I use them myself because you saw that big, long, complicated text. You can't, quote it verbatim. But I really worried that these types of summary were really imperfect and they were undermining practice. They were undermining the implementation of this important and innovative legal obligation. And what I said back then was I started to say, voice is not enough. We can't deal with voice. And I came up with this notion that it should be space, voice, audience, and influence. I read it with the children's data, but I also read it with my own understanding of the wider convention. You'll see as you go into this work, and as Scotland leads the way in child rights across the world, you can't look at one right without looking at a range of other rights. And the rights that are particularly important when you're looking at children's right to be heard are these: non-discrimination, best interest, protection from harm, and freedom of expression, as well as parents and adults guidance. But I'm going to go through those very, very briefly. Okay, so that's my model. That was the old iteration in the academic article that is really hard to use. This is the latest version of it, which comes from the Irish government's national framework on child participation. So they have it as a dial, which shows that actually I think there's a chronological order: space, voice, audience, and influence, and then you kind of start again. And those are a very brief summary of what the 4 concepts mean: opportunity to express a view, facilitation, expressing the view, making sure it's listened to and who's listening to it, and then acting upon it. So I'm going to really briefly go through those 4 concepts and then show you some examples from practice. Starting with space, the legal obligation is assure to the child, and that's really strong. It's really strong human rights legal terminology, and we've interpreted that to mean it has to be actively created. So wherever you are, it's not kind of waiting until the child comes and tells you what they think. If they do come and tell you what you think, then there is an obligation. But even if they don't, it's actually actively going out to find out what children's views are, because they might not come and tell you. The space has to be safe. That means that it has to be, a space where they're comfortable. And we talk about children not fear and rebuke. A lot of times children are put down when they give a view that perhaps doesn't seem sensible or practical to an adult. Or worse, reprisal, where actually a child is afraid to give their view because they feel they'll be punished in some way. And we know in lots of contexts, that's how children feel. And also this space needs to be an inclusive space. And I think for the work that many of you do, one of the groups who are most, poorly served by this provision are very young children. There's no question of that. The other group that are very poorly served are children with disabilities, particularly children with intellectual impairments. And I think whenever you get to young children with disabilities, particularly intellectual impairments, you have a group that almost never get asked at all. And that's incredibly important that they're included. That space, so I can see them on the slides. Voice is the right to express a view. That's the concept we were more comfortable with. Very important is no human right that's an obligation apart from the right to education. Also an obligation. So it's not about forcing children to speak. It's actually giving them the option and to exercise the right, and they don't have to. They just don't have to tell you what they think. Although, of course, it's really important. I know that, some of you will know this from your work, all of you, that silence is a really powerful way of communicating. And sometimes when children say nothing, they're saying an awful lot, and we need to be able to learn to read that. Choice in the mode of expression. This is really important. It's about, if you read this with Article 13 of the Convention, which is the right to freedom of expression, it's in a medium of the child's choice. So, of course, we know that some children will be very happy communicating orally. Some children might want to, it might be something about observing them and their behaviour, which we're going to come to that, and in lots of other ways, through art, through play, through all the possibilities that I know lots of you work on and do wonderful things with. This is crucial to your work. The right is afforded to all children capable of forming a view. Now, this was very misunderstood whenever I wrote this first article. People thought that the idea of age and maturity, you only had to ask children or involve them if they were in relation to their age and maturity, so they were able to give a mature or sensible view. And that is not what the provision says. The right to express a view is capable to every child who can form it. It's nothing to do with the age of maturity. The weight to be given to the view, the due weight, comes later, and that's in relation to age of maturity, but not the right to express. And that's so important in the work that I know that you all do, is really from the earliest stages of a child's life, encouraging expression and encourage them to feel that they are heard and taken seriously is crucial for so many aspects of a child's life and rights. And they may need help to both form and express views. Again, that can be read in accordance with other parts of the convention, but particularly Article 5, which puts a right and a duty on parents and others to guide and advise the child. So it's not, one of the things that I get frustrated with is whenever people say to me, oh, I went and talked to that group of children and, they'd nothing to say. And it's just, I've never been with a group of children who had nothing to say. Sometimes they just needed time and patience, and they needed, help to think, what could your view be? Here's some options. What do you think of those options? And it's really helping them to build, to scaffold, and to form views. Again, it could be very important for all children, not just the very young. One of the big myths, I've tucked it in here for you, is that they're too young. They're too young. I mean, I've heard that very often. You couldn't consult children under 8, under 6, under 4, under 2, babies, And the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been very, very strong on this, both in its comment on early childhood and on the right to be heard, saying, full implementation, we need to be looking for non-verbal forms of communication like play, body language, and facial expressions, etc. Because we know, and I'm preaching to experts here, so I will stop where in my head. I know that you know that too. Why have I got a wee meme? I just always find it amusing that adults who would say, you couldn't talk to them, they're too young. So many adults use baby memes to express a really powerful emotion that they don't want to put into words, because of course we know that babies in particular and toddlers are so honest and so expressive that actually adults use them for their own communication, which is a bit of an irony. Third part of the model is audience, and that is sometimes, this model has been used a lot, and some people drop audience and just don't do that. To me, in some ways, I think they're all important, but audience is really important from a legal perspective. And a human rights perspective, because in the human rights perspective, the child is the rights holder. Adults are duty bearers. You are a duty bearer, I'm a duty bearer, and we're the people who have the obligation to take the child's views and give them due weight. Okay, so what's really matters for me is obviously audience can be about active listening, and there's lots of really brilliant literature on that with children. But what also is really important is for me is identifying who is listening and letting the child know. Because in terms of audience, we need to know who has the power to affect change in the child's life. So that might just be the child's carer in the one-to-one, not just, that might be the child's carer in a one-to-one basis. It might be, if you're in an NGO, that might be the board or the management board who has access to resource, or it may be parents. So we need to know who actually can influence this decision when the child has a view, who's in the position to actually be the decision maker and make it happen if it's possible. And so sometimes we actually need these kind of formal channels of communication. And what I describe it as now often is the idea of a dedicated listener. And that dedicated listener is the person with power. Finally, Holy Grail, influence, and that is that the child's views should be given due weight. This is a hard one to kind of capture, and I've done some more recent work on this. Crucially, we need to ensure that there's formal response and feedback. Feedback is really important, and I've got a new model which is really about the quality of feedback that I can talk about in questions, because I think feedback, when you tell the child what you're doing, your child says, I would like this, and you as an adult then have to say to them, there is the kind of telling them that you heard them, yes, you asked for this. And then it's really responding them to say, I am able to do this, and this is how I'm going to do it. I'm not able to do this, and this is the reasons why I'm not able to do it, or I'm able to do part of it and I'm not able to do the rest. But it's always about feeding back. Why is that so important to me and to the human rights framework? Human rights are ultimately about accountability, state accountability. And it seems to me that when we're trying to make Article 12 real, this is the critical moment, the critical juncture where you as the adult decision maker are accountable to the child, and that transparency about what you've done is crucial to that. And what it does by giving really good feedback every time, it helps do what I called for many years ago, is creating the conditions where some adults, take children's views and then ignore them. And this gives a chance for that kind of dialogue that can keep on going about whatever's going on in the child's life. here's a lovely example, and I've just tucked it into this for today. It's an article that I love. It's by Priscilla Alderson and colleagues, and it's called The Participation Rights of Premature Babies. And I loved it when I read it because it actually challenges all our assumptions about who has rights and who can be heard. And what the researchers in this case did, the researchers at University College London, is they went and did observations in a neonatal unit. And what they observed in the neonatal unit is that when the babies were happy, it tended to be when lights were low, sounds were quiet, and they had the touch of parents or carers, the nurse in this instance, in this picture. And when babies had bright lights, loud noise, and no touch, they cried. And what they said was that this was the children expressing their views, and then the obligation on the duty bearers was where they could. And there's times when you need bright lights and there would be noise in terms of giving the children their treatments, but where it was possible to create the conditions where these children's views were respected and their views were expressed through being content or not. Okay. So I'm going to finish up and say that the Lundy model has been used a lot across the world, but I've had the privilege of working with the Irish government, who are one of a small number of governments in the world who have not just a national plan for children, but they have a national child and youth participation strategy. And this year, not this year, I kept getting it wrong, in 2021, they developed a national youth and participation framework based on my model. And it has lots of useful tools. This is one is a planning checklist, lots of questions to ask. Adults can ask themselves about whether they're fully involved in children and young people in policies and services and planning. And it's just really good prompts to think about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and really to encourage further and better practice. This one might be of particular interest to you. We had a previous policy checklist that had been running from 2015 that's very well used across the world. But what came back from our practitioners, including our early childhood professionals and our teachers and our Garda, the police in the south of Ireland, was they wanted something really simple and what they called an everyday checklist. So this is now in posters in schools and nurseries and early childhood centres. Just really simple questions. Again, you can ask about your just day-to-day interaction with children, a really simple letter question. So for example, under voice, how can children raise matters if the things that matter to them is a really good question. So obviously we can go and ask children, what do you want here with our own adult agenda, but it's always making sure there's space and send, anything you want to talk about, what's happening, so it's very simple and I think very accessible. Likewise, this was developed with a group of children and young people. I think it would need adapted for very young children, but I'm sure there's a way of adapting something like this. And these are the children and young people come up with these kind of statements, and I think obviously children, who don't read won't use this, but there's questions that they could be asked that are like this about finding out from children. And I think it's really important, not just to ask children their views, not just to tell them what we've done with their views, but actually just to keep checking with them that they feel they're heard and listened to. And there are questions that could be asked that way and be a good project for somebody. Okay, final thing is a Scottish thing, and then I'm going to stop. I just thought I'd mention this because I'm with you in Scotland, and I love Scotland because Scotland's doing such great work on child rights. But I had the pleasure this year of doing a project with Mary Mitchell from the University of Edinburgh and Dr. Louise Hill from Children First. As many of you probably know, Scotland is setting up a Barnhouse, a Bairnhouse in Scotland, and Children First are leading with that. And I was involved in a really lovely project on really using the Lundy model to reflect on the Barnhouse model. The Barnhouse model is where children who have been victims or witnesses of crime go along to one house to tell their story. And we got involved in this project, written guidance on that, which I can share the link to. But what became really, I did a lot of learning in that project, with Mary and Louise. And two bits of the learning were this, about the relationship between participation and protecting, keeping children safe. Everyone knows you've got to hear children to protect them. But what became really clear to us is, you can't hear them unless they feel safe. And how do you create the conditions where children feel safe? So this is the space element of my model. And that is, you can't really do it for one child if you don't work with a group of children. So what became really important to us is how significant collective participation is if you actually want to deliver participation for individual children. Final point is, there's no one right way to do this. It's doing child participation is child decision and context specific. What my model does is offer kind of qualities of rights-based participation, questions you can ask yourself to really think about it and implement it in your own way, in your own context. That's me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, Amy.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was fascinating and so helpful for all of us. I think without me taking up any more time talking, I know that people will have questions on this, and we've got quite a few people to get through. So if people want to just use the raise hand reaction or write in the chat a question, you can then ask verbally, or I can ask on your behalf your written question. So anyone who has questions for Laura, please just go ahead and indicate. Go on then, Sophie, I'll kick off with you.
Thank you. I'm not going to hog the time because it's really for our grantees, but it'll give you some time to think. Laura, thank you so much. That is, sorry, you hear this probably all the time, but so inspirational. And so I think all the questions, you've got all the answers in here. So there's quite a few people where I felt like, oh, could you just take their head and put it right in front of the screen now? My specific question is, you know, in terms of the implementation from all your experience, if you think sort of there's the usual suspects, and I suppose we've got the usual suspects today around people who are already working with children and who want to improve their practice, but by ways of the wider discussions for bodies that, and I'm thinking of audit bodies, I'm thinking of regulators. So how have you in previous projects in Ireland and beyond drawn in their attention to say, well, this is not just something that you need to look at how other people do that, but actually this is something for you as well. Is there any top tips or starting points for conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, Sophie. And, you know, we always wonder, and there's no right answer, you know, top up, you know, top down, bottom up, you know, in the middle, where do we start? And of course we have to do it all. Ireland is really unusual because they did something really brave, and it was like a wonderful civil servant who had the courage to do it in 2012, that they have a national strategy. So what that meant was every government department and every public body, including the regulators, so including the inspection services, etc., all have to have actions under the strategy. And it started off, you know, some of it started off really sort of simpering, I would say, you know, and the usual suspects, you wouldn't think are the usual suspects were the least ambitious. But back in that day, I got in the room with those government departments and agencies, and that's how we created the first checklist. And it started to get, as people started to think, oh, maybe I can do it, maybe I can do it. And I'm a great pragmatist in child participation. You will find purists, I'm not one. I've written an article in defense of tokenism. And what I mean by that is I think we need to encourage people to put a toe in the water and start and learn and not be so intimidated out of it that they think they can't do anything. And then what they do is they hive it out to somebody else. They feel they are not capable themselves. And that's the opposite of what I would like to encourage you to do today, is try something, see if it works, ask children, did it work? Learn from that, ask children how to make it better, work with them to make it better the next time. That's what we've done. So what have we done? What are the big successes in Ireland? It's hard to know because, you know, for instance, one of the areas you find wouldn't be so good was their help, they call it TUSLA, that's their child protection agency. So social workers, but they grabbed it immediately. They have their own strategy based on the model. They've trained all social workers. They've funded it. They've provided all sorts of ways. And then over time, the sector I find the hardest to crack in some ways is the sector I love the most, and that's education, you know. So you've got individual teachers in schools. There's schools in the south of Ireland that have the Lundy model in the child's homework diaries, which I think is strange, but it's really telling the children, you know, you're entitled to be heard. But for instance, I worked with the Irish Inspectorate, education inspectorate. So I've trained every Irish inspector, and then they have really, and in the room, you know, when you're training, I could see the people over at the end who were like just never going to buy it, you know, and then, you know, that was not their way. And you could see the others who were just at the front, like absolutely waiting for it. And over time, people really come in, embrace it, own it. And particularly in that event, interesting to you, there was a bunch of new inspectors in early childhood, and they were loving it. And actually just really thinking of ways they could do that in terms of inspections of, you know, early childhood settings in the south of Ireland. So yeah, it can happen and people do it. And there's lots of wonderful examples now. but I didn't put this because I only had the 15 odd minutes. You know, when I do a longer training, one of my slides says, you know, it's never perfect. It's never, ever. I've never done anything with children and I've gone away and said, yo, that was fantastic. I would just do exactly that again. It's never perfect. So just don't be afraid to start and try. And I think that's what I would encourage everyone to do.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Sophie, for your question. Gary Donohan, thank you for putting a question in the chat for Laura. So Gary's question is, are there common challenges or barriers that are cited or perceived in implementing this model effectively? Are there elements of the model that are more challenging to implementing with true quality? That's Gary's question.
Yeah, Gary, it is a good question. And it, I think being fully inclusive is the first big challenge. It's not in the model itself. I think it's in practice, is actually being sure, particularly children with disabilities or children who do not communicate in typical ways, they're always left out. You know, and in our own work, we've been really trying to make sure that doesn't happen. So having it fully inclusive, and I mentioned, you know, in any government strategies, it's often young children left out. And sometimes that's right. You know, maybe I'll come back to that, which might be controversial. There are some things you cannot ask babies about, you know, and that's okay, you know, and there's things that affect their lives, you know, that's okay too. So sometimes we having some kind of common sense about it is a really good thing. But the actual bit of my model that is the hardest to implement, unquestionably, is influence. You know, because I think in some ways when I wrote it, I did what I think the big lawyer get out. I went for, in lawyers, whenever you can't deliver what we would think of substantive justice, like a good outcome, you go for procedural justice, a good process. And that's what I did with influence and the emphasis on feedback. But it's really hard to get that right, which is why I revisited it in 2018. And the new Irish framework I've got this 4F framework for feedback, and the new Irish framework includes it. And I mentioned it briefly to you, but one of the dimensions of that is really ensuring that we engage with what they say, and we show we engage with what they say. And I have a set of questions that I ask people who've asked children their views really to think about and respond to children. And I think doing that, it doesn't deliver influence, but I think it makes it much more likely that we will give children's views proper consideration, you know? So yeah, that's the hardest bit for all of us, really.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think there's just a technical question just asking, will we provide links to your work to explore more? And if you're happy, Laura, I can do that with participants of the links you mentioned.
Yeah, the national framework is really helpful. It's the most up-to-date, you know, guidance for practitioners, written with practitioners, you know, with me as an expert, and by Anne O'Donnell, who was the civil servant who, you know, pushed the whole Irish thing. So it's a very good thing.
Thank you. And then we've got a question here from Rukia. So she asks, how has this challenged when you have language or cultural differences within the society, and what changes have been made because of these?
Yeah, so I think they're two separate but interrelated things. And I think, well, language differences the model has been translated all over the world. So if there's a language that you want, I'm sure we could probably find a version of it. And I do think that sometimes things get lost in language. So I don't know sometimes whether my concepts translate. I'm in a project in a minute, which is really interesting, a European project where we've taken the word participation and we're translating it, you know, and what we're realizing in this big European group, not just European, because we've got colleagues who are Chinese, Arabic, speaking Arabic, and we haven't yet got someone speaking Russian, but speaking lots of languages. The word doesn't exist in lots of languages, or it means something else, you know, so I'm not always sure that what I say when it translates captures the meaning. So you need someone who really understands the right, the Article 12 right to translate it into concepts that work. In terms of cultural, I think that is a really important point. And again, it has been used in various communities where there are perhaps Indigenous communities within, you know, families. So for instance, in Australia and New Zealand, it's been used with Indigenous children. And I do think then that the challenge there is not my model, because the concepts still work. The challenge there is the right itself, and how you interpret that in the context of particular cultural values. So for instance, if you take the Maori children, what becomes really incredibly important to them is their whānau, which is the community, not just the family, and the parents. And actually the parents are incredibly important. So the Article 5 concept of that becomes so much more important about how you consult and the ways that you consult, as well as being respectful. Again, I have lots of students working on this. I have lots of students who are African and work in African contexts, and that can be particularly interesting there, because the rights framework there in African communities is different. Actually, the convention standard on children's rights in Africa, that in Africa they have the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which has something our convention doesn't have, which is respect for elders. And that can be, that can be something that can be seen to actually undermine Article 12, or it can be interpreted in ways in which are culturally respectful to, elders and tribes and whatever. So yeah, I think culture is important for all. Language is always important, and cultural context is crucial. But we also get cultural contexts that aren't really even related to that, just within, I think, certain like smaller communities. But I'd be interested in hearing more about that from you as well.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. And Rukia says thank you as well. I wonder if anyone else has any comments or questions after those. If you do, just put them in the chat, or just indicate whichever way you prefer. Is that another question, Gary, for you?
Sorry, I tend to ask too many questions actually. But what you said, Laura, about influence resonated with me. Things I've maybe perceived or witnessed. I know for a fact, and many of us probably do, that practitioners on the ground are often excellent at really, including children and young people and the processes that they have perhaps power over. Is there, it's hard to word the question, but is there a role for adults in championing the voice of children and young people, accepting that the upper echelons haven't fully adapted as yet? I'm maybe a progressivist like yourself, Laura. I like to see these small steps, even if they are small steps. But is there a role in the current system for adults who truly allow children and young people to participate and will champion that voice, maybe bridge that divide, seek that influence where there's currently a barrier, where a local practitioner is excellent at that but has very little influence themselves? There could perhaps be some mechanism there. But
I think so, crucially, Gary, because what I feel is, if you lift away from all of this to what gets children's rights implemented in practice, and ultimately I think there are going to be doubters out there in your own context, of people who think this is all nonsense and whatever. And then there are likes of you who already, the very fact turned up today, are probably not those people. And you have such a role to play to be champions for children's rights, and children's rights, particularly in early childhood. And the way you can champion it often is just, through your own excellence and your own expertise. And that's, I've done quite a bit of work in early child, not me myself, but listened to a lot of early childhood work in the last 2 years in lockdown online. And, I'm stunned by, if people working with older children could just see what you can do. Now, I know sometimes you have scope to do things like, people working in formal education and at the end, are worried about exams, don't. But there's such creative and important and good practice. And such ultimately and fundamentally all of this, I haven't time, but ultimately the Article 12 right comes from respect for the worth of the child's dignity and the child's right to equality. And so many early childhood practitioners just live and breathe that. And you don't need to be told Article 12 or the Lundy model, but if you actually come at it from that fundamental position of respect for this worth of this little human being, that you're very likely to kind of convey and behave in certain ways. And that will mean practices which seem normal to you, but we also know, because we've seen such terrible things done to young children. And I don't mean about the real horrors that we hear. I mean in just everyday practices in early childhood settings, things that actually cut to children's dignity and respect for their worth as a human person. And I think the more that people champion it and show how you build that, and how you build, where I think you have a really, really important role is in terms of building children's capacity for autonomy. and giving them from the very start this sense that they matter and their views matter. So even where they're not really getting to make choices, it's that, the practices that I think you will all do, and those of you who are parents, I hope I did this too, is, when you're doing something to a child where they have no choice, that you're explaining what you're doing it and why you're doing it, and all of that is building them towards the opportunity to input into those decisions and to make informed choices, which is the realization of the right. That's very long-winded, I'm sorry, and a bit preachy, but I know you all get it.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Gary, for your question. We've got probably time for just one more question, and this one's from Claire, and she says she's referencing particularly preschool age children here, just a premise, but she was asking if you had any ideas about supporting children with ASD in participation. She said that they already use PECs and they respond to behavioral cues. However, this is more reactive process. She was just wondering if you could comment on that, Laura.
So I don't know what PECs is, but I think it's absolutely crucial. I think particularly with children with ASD, and I think for whether they've ASD or any disability or anything, every child is communicating. Every child is communicating in some way, and I think those who work with children, their families, their parents, their carers, their teachers, they know how to communicate with them and they know what they're saying. So so it doesn't really matter as long as, that you are responding with respect and supporting and engaging. I think I'm trying to get underneath what you mean by reactive. Is that if a child wants something, then you're engaging with that? And are you meaning that this active idea of going out and helping them to design maybe policies and services? I think there's loads and loads of good examples of that now with children with ASD. For sure. I mean, I've supervised a couple of really great PhD students on it, including one from a person who was a lecturer in Ireland who worked with young people with ASD to develop ways they could input into their own in education plans, individual assessments. It's different in Scotland, the term, but it's, there are ways in which you can get those children to design, and it might be working with them individually, but eventually coming back and explaining, ways in which you can improve service for them. But I hope I'm answering your question, but I don't think it's that different to a lot of other children. I think it's just knowing how they communicate and responding to that, or engaging with them in an active way on that.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Claire, for your question.
Sorry, can I just say something about that picture exchange communication system?
Yeah.
I don't know this, but I know that in Scotland, I think Scotland's the home of Talking Mats, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, Talking Mats is fantastic. And I've just seen wonderful work with Talking Mats, and I think with lots of children. And I know they now use the Lundy model because it is, kind of as a marriage. I like them and they like me. You could see that actually their way of using Talking Mats won't work for every children, but it's similar. Talking Mats is, again, another mechanism, and it depends what that child uses and that child's comfortable with. But there are means, and it's what the child's using. Yeah.
Fab, thank you. And Claire says it's similar to Talking Mats.
Okay, yeah, which is good.
I think we have time for just one more question. If anyone wanted to ask a final question, just got 5 minutes left.
So can I ask a question? So what I love at these things is when I learn, and I know, there are so many of you out there, working with children, and you're doing really engaging things. Does anybody want to share something they feel that they're doing that is, and just they feel like it's really working, when they're talking particularly to very young children? So I know there are people in the room who are doing fantastic things. So yeah, I know Rona as well, because of course I know Rona quite well now.
Just for everyone else, I'm doing a master's in children's rights with Laura at Queen's. So I've got to spend some time with Laura over the last few months, which has been fantastic. We are doing we're in some early stages because Starcatchers we're an arts and early years organisation specifically focused on children from babies and children from birth to 5 and their parents and carers. And we've been really fascinated in this kind of conversation around how do you listen to and respond to the voice of pre and non-verbal children. So with some support from CatNac, actually, we're just embarking on the first part of a kind of a bigger research project that we want to do that can look at developing an arts-based methodology around being able to kind of look at consultation participation with pre and non-verbal children. So to me, it's like we're scratching the surface of it. We know that in terms of some of the work that we do with very young children and their parents and carers in communities, that the artists that we're working with are constantly responding to how the children are engaging with our materials, and all of that is informing our work. But we feel like that can go so much further, and we've developed our own engagement signals in previous phases of research that we utilize, and we use things like the Leuven scale and things like that. But actually, because of the incorporation and now the implementation of UNCRC, it feels like it's even more important that we're exploring different ways that our youngest children's kind of voices, views, perspectives can be shared and respected. And I think it's complex when we're talking about pre and non-verbal children, but every week I think I'm blown away by the capacity that they have to share with us, and I think there's a real opportunity here for us to really share that much more broadly. And I think that point from the general comment around what actually does the voice of the child, what does that mean? It's not just about verbal communication. I think that is a kind of real key message that we need to be sharing much more broadly. I think it's implicit in lots of ways, but actually we need to be much more explicit around how very young children can share their perspectives with us, and how we can engage with that in a meaningful way.
Great, thanks, Rona. Thank you. Wonderful practice, and I'm sure that lots of you have it as well. There's another question there. Visual aids, yeah. Makaton. I mean, it's really, how does that child communicate? And there's no child not communicating. When we look at the Alderson work and the neonates, there's always a way of engaging with it. If that can be engaged with, any child can be engaged with, and even like you say, the policy and the unit. I mean, I'd say young children can't be consulted in policy, but their experiences count. And if we know what their experiences are, that can feed into policy, even if they're not feeding directly into policy. That's the other point I'd make. If you're interested, I know we're in our last minute, I just remembered that you're asking about Ireland, and there's quite a good strong early childhood sector in Ireland as well. And Anne O'Donnell, who drafted the strategy, and myself were interviewed in a podcast with one of the people from Early Childhood Ireland about early childhood. And so I can share that maybe as a little link. It's just a way, if you're out for a jog or a run, you can hear us talking, because I learned a lot listening to Myra Corbett, who interviewed us, and Anne, and I have a few random things to say myself, I think, as well, so it might be useful.
Thank you, Laura, and I can circulate that link with the materials. If you just send it to me, I'll circulate that to everyone who participated today. I think that's just us just out of time, so I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for attending, and a huge thank you to Laura for coming along and speaking to us today. I know I found it fascinating. I think everyone else will have done. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. See you.
See you soon, Rona. So Amy, I'll send you that link then. Is that the only one you want, or do you want the national framework as well?
If we could just have as many as possible, because what we'll also do, with your permission, is to put them in our
Yeah,
website.
sure.
It has your recorded video, and then underneath we can link the resources there.
Yeah, I think then I'll just send you the national framework and the podcast. There's also a really lovely little blog was done by one of the practitioner in the south of Ireland on just what she did in her own early childhood setting and using the Lundy model. And it was, I'll see if I can find that. I remember reading it and thinking it was just kind of very simple and very straight, but very thoughtful, you know. Yeah, I'll see if I can find that as well. I didn't write it. Yeah.
Oh, fab. Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciated today.
Okay, all the best.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.